Welcome to this explainer on the Columbian Medical Exchange. We're going to be diving deep into the really surprising origins of Mesoamerican folk medicine. Today, we're exploring how a massive clash of empires accidentally created a completely new medical system. Let's get right into it. Okay, so we're going to start by dropping right into a central medical mystery. Picture this. You go to contemporary Mexico, you visit a traditional healer, and you stumble onto something that sounds, well, kind of like a paradox. They tell you that a cup of coffee is hot. Now, it absolutely doesn't matter if that coffee is steaming fresh from the pot, lukewarm, or poured over ice. Metaphorically, to the healer, that coffee possesses a hot quality. So why does this matter? Well, in this system of folk healing, if you have a hot illness, there is no way you can treat it with a hot food or remedy. You can't use that iced coffee. This is the famous hot and cold dichotomy of Mesoamerican folk medicine. But it really makes you wonder, where did this idea actually come from? To answer that, we have to rewind and look at the elite science of 16th century Europe, humoral theory. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't some fringe folk magic. This was the absolute cutting-edge, university-taught medicine of the Spanish colonizers. It originated with the ancient Greeks, was codified by Galen, and perfected by Arab scholars like Avicenna. Basically, this framework viewed human health as a really delicate balance of four internal humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And each humor was linked to the fundamental elements of the earth, carrying hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities. The whole shebang was based on the principle of opposites. So if you had a fever, a hot illness, your doctor prescribed a cold remedy, period. And this elite European scientific paradigm was about to cross the Atlantic Ocean and change the New World forever. So, let's set the scene. Here in Western Mesoamerica, the geographic stage was set for an epic collision of medical cultures. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they were absolutely blown away by the medical mastery of the Aztec Empire. They found these vast, incredibly organized botanical gardens, like Emperor Moctezuma's legendary gardens in Oxtepec. The indigenous healers there possessed a massive pharmacopoeia of medicinal herbs that Europeans had just never seen before. In fact, the Spanish were so impressed that rumor has it Hernán Cortés actually urged Emperor Charles V not to send any Spanish doctors over, because the native healers were already just so incredibly skilled. The Spanish saw these native botanical wonders, and naturally, immediately wanted to understand them. But they could really only understand them through their own European scientific lens. So, in 1570, King Philip II sends his personal physician, Francisco Hernandez, over to New Spain to inventory this massive new natural world. And before he returned, Hernandez had cataloged over 3,000 New World plants. That's a staggering amount. But he didn't just make a list. He systematically assigned European hot and cold humoral values to almost every single one of them. For instance, he categorized native squash as cold and humid, making it perfect for a hot fever. He essentially took this entirely indigenous botanical world and forced it right into an imported Greco-Arab scientific box.
Now, take a look at the strict class-based hierarchy of colonial medicine enforced by the Spanish Medical Board, the Royal Protomedicato. It's really revealing. At the very top, you have the physicians, elite university-trained men who lectured in Latin. Just below them were the surgeons and pharmacists, educated through apprenticeships. Further down the ladder were the phlebotomists, or bleeders, who were often of mixed racial ancestry and learned their trade in barbershops. And finally, at the very bottom, existing completely outside the legal framework altogether, were the indigenous midwives and traditional healers. You see, medicine wasn't just about healing. It was a mirror of the rigid social and racial stratification of the whole colonial empire.
But, the reality of colonial medicine on the ground was vastly different from what the Royal Board actually envisioned. Getting a university medical education required proving blood purity, meaning no Jewish, Muslim, or black ancestry, which essentially restricted the top tier exclusively to wealthy Spaniards and Creoles. Because of this, those elite physicians were totally inaccessible to the vast majority of the public. If you lived in a rural area, you were pretty much out of luck. You had to rely on the lower classes of healers, like the barbers and bleeders, or even more likely, you relied on missionary friars. These friars set up hospital annexes in remote areas, and the medical care they provided to the indigenous and mestizo populations was based entirely on, you guessed it, their own European humoral theories. So this leads us to a really crucial point. Before the Spanish arrived, the indigenous populations had incredibly complex, distinct medical specialists. You had the Nahuatilcitl, or the Maya Ha Men. These were highly trained professionals who handled both the physical and the spiritual health of their people. But under Spanish rule, these diverse professionals were abruptly stripped of their status. They were all lumped together into a single, technically illegal, and totally marginalized Spanish category, the curandero. This simple label effectively homogenized hundreds of unique indigenous medical traditions and forced them to operate in the shadows.
To truly grasp the collision that followed, we really need to look at what those indigenous medical beliefs actually were before the cultural mashup. Pre-conquest healers viewed illness not as some imbalance of bodily fluids, but often as a divine punishment or the result of violating a taboo. They treated conditions like susto, which is literally the loss of the soul caused by a severe fright. You had highly specialized practitioners like chupadores, who would literally suck intruded disease objects right out of the body, and sovidores, who were absolute masters of therapeutic massage. It was a deeply holistic system that relied heavily on magic, spirituality, and just an incredible mastery of native botany.
And this brings us to the tragic, incredibly unequal nature of the Columbian exchange. Think about it. While Europeans gained amazing new botanical remedies and massively superior food sources like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, which vastly improved their health and fueled huge population growth back in the Old World, what did the indigenous people gain? They were hit with devastating new diseases, smallpox, measles, malaria, plagues for which they had absolutely zero natural immunity and against which their traditional magic and herbs suddenly just failed. Desperate to understand and fight these terrifying new illnesses, they absorbed the only other medical framework available to them, European humoral theory. And this is exactly where the synthesis happens. I want to be clear here. The adoption of the principle of opposites wasn't just some academic exercise. It was an absolute survival mechanism. Remember those rural missionary hospitals we talked about? Indigenous and mestizo populations were being treated there by friars who constantly talked about hot fevers and cold remedies. Desperate to treat these imported plagues, the local populations adapted this elite Spanish logic. They took their ancient pre-Hispanic botanical cures and basically reclassified them into the hot and cold framework of their colonizers. They effectively merged the two systems just to try and stay alive.
To show you just how incredibly mashed up this got, you have to hear about Fray Juan de Estanifer's actual 18th century smallpox cure. Okay, step 1, pray to specific Catholic saints. Step 2, and this is wild, keep alive sheep in the sick room. Why? Because a sheep was considered metaphorically cold, so the idea was it would absorb the hot evil of the smallpox fever. And step 3, have the patient drink European barley water, which was the ultimate cold humoral drink, mixed with the native Mexican lanten root, which is also cold. It is this bizarre, almost comical three-step mashup of Catholic hagiology, elite Galenic humoral theory, native botany, and pure, unfiltered desperation in action.
All of this builds into a much broader historical picture. Historian Alfred Crosby actually coined the term the Columbian exchange to describe this exact phenomenon. He framed the conquest not just as a military war or political takeover, but as a massive, accidental biological and medical trade. The very air, the plants, the germs, and the medical philosophies of two entirely separate hemispheres basically crashed into one another, permanently altering the biology and the culture of both sides forever.
So, what's the big takeaway? Why does all of this matter to us today? Well, it teaches us that traditional folk medicine is never static. It's not some frozen relic of the ancient past. Instead, it is a living, breathing archive of human history. When a modern curandero tells you to avoid an iced coffee because it's hot, you aren't just hearing an old wives' tale. You are hearing the direct echo of a 16th century Spanish university lecture, mixed together with the botanical genius of the Aztec Empire, all forged in the desperate crucible of colonial survival. History is quite literally encoded into an everyday remedy.
Which brings us to our final thought. We so often draw a hard line between modern elite scientific medicine and ancient alternative folk tradition. But as we've uncovered in this explainer, the folk medicine of the marginalized classes in Mesoamerica was actually born from the absolute highest, most elite European science of its day. So it leaves us with a really fascinating question to ponder. Are today's alternative folk medicines actually just the remnants of yesterday's elite sciences? Keep questioning the history behind what we think we know, and thanks for joining me.